The cream of supernova bisque bubbled in Gary Harper's chipped ceramic bowl, its iridescent surface reflecting the neon lights that filtered through his tiny window. Outside, New Avalon City sprawled in all its 2158 glory, a chaotic metropolis of gravity-defying skyscrapers, hover traffic, and the constant thrum of interorbital commerce. Gary stirred the soup absently, his mind elsewhere. Another day. Another series of packages delivered across the city's convoluted grid. The courier job barely paid for his cramped skyloft, a shoebox suspended 60 floors above the ancient pavement. But it was honest work. Or at least, that's what Gary told himself each morning as he strapped on his delivery exo boots. "Felix, you're plotting again, aren't you?" Gary addressed the emerald-scaled lizard, watching him intently from its terrarium. The creature's eyes narrowed to calculating slits as it basked under its heat lamp. "I can tell when you're scheming. Something about the way your left eye twitches." Felix flicked his tongue in what Gary had long ago decided was the reptilian equivalent of disdain. "Don't give me that look. If it weren't for me, you'd be someone's wallet by now." Gary smiled despite himself. The lizard had been his sole companion for 3 years, ever since he'd rescued the creature from an exotic pet shop going out of business. Gary often imagined Felix was planning world domination from his glass kingdom. It made the loneliness of New Avalon a little more bearable. What Gary couldn't know, was that high above the atmospheric ceiling of Earth, beyond the lunar colonies and the Mars terraforming projects, the High Council of Improbable Affairs was monitoring reality's stability. 12 beings of incomprehensible form sat at a round table that wasn't quite round, discussing fluctuations in the cosmic balance that weren't quite fluctuations. Their conference room existed in a dimension adjacent to conventional spacetime, and their discussions shaped the destiny of galaxies. Sector 7G shows increasing entropy values, intoned Council Member Fee, their voice like the rustling of infinite pages. The reality engine requires adjustment. "The dragons must be fed," agreed Councilmember Omega, whose outline shimmered with probability. "But the current caretaker is unsuitable. The patterns show degradation." "A replacement must be found," concluded Councilmember Alpha, the eldest and most incomprehensible of them all. "One with potential for necessary innovation within acceptable parameters." Back in his apartment, Gary lifted a spoonful of soup to his lips. The bisque was his one luxury, imported from the Jupiter gourmet colonies at exorbitant cost. Each mouthful contained the essence of collapsed stellar material, harvested at the precise moment of supernova and preserved in quantum stasis. It tasted like the color blue feels when you close your eyes on a summer day. Indescribable, yet somehow familiar. He didn't notice the microscopic object that fell from somewhere beyond the ceiling, a dimensional hiccup that deposited what appeared to be a cosmic fingernail clipping into his dinner. The fragment, smaller than a dust mote, was in fact a fallen piece from the creator's right hand, specifically the pinky nail, shed during a routine universal manicure. Gary swallowed the contaminated spoonful and immediately felt nothing. No dramatic transformation, no sudden insight, no painful mutation, just the lingering taste of stardust and butter. Then the wall of his apartment shimmered. The shimmering intensified, colors inverting briefly before tearing open like wet tissue paper. Through this improbable aperture stepped a figure clad in armor that appeared to be constructed from artfully arranged junkyard scraps and precious metals. The effect was both intimidating and absurdly stylish. "Ambassador Zyla." The figure introduced herself with a curt nod. Her voice had the texture of velvet wrapped around gravel. "Gary Harper, you have been chosen." She paused dramatically. "To feed the dragons." Gary blinked. His spoon clattered to the floor. "I think you have the wrong apartment." He managed, rising from his chair. "I deliver packages. Dragons aren't." "Your DNA has been altered by the Selector. There is no mistake." Ambassador Zyla gestured at his half-eaten soup. "You have ingested the catalyst. The choice is made." "What catalyst? It's just supernova bisque," Gary protested, backing away until his shoulders hit the wall. "Look, I have deliveries tomorrow. I can't just—" "Pack essentials only." Zyla cut in, her armored gauntlet gesturing dismissively. You have 7 minutes. The citadel of possibility awaits its new caretaker. Gary's mind raced through a catalog of possible responses, settling finally on blind panic. This had to be some elaborate prank. Perhaps that new delivery company trying to eliminate competition? Or was he hallucinating from expired bisque? But deep in his gut, where the cosmic fingernail fragment was already rewriting trivial portions of his genetic code, Gary knew this was real. Something had changed in the fabric of his personal reality, and the universe was rearranging itself around him. 7 minutes. Zyla repeated, her armor reconfiguring slightly as she folded her arms. The dragons grow hungry. Gary's packing process resembled a whirlwind having an anxiety attack. He stuffed his backpack with whatever his hands found first: 3 mismatched socks, his toothbrush, a half-empty tube of hair gel, 2 protein bars, and his lucky cap emblazoned with the faded logo of the Jupiter Jetstreams, a hoverdisk team that hadn't won a championship in 30 years. "Felix!" he gasped, suddenly remembering his pet. "I can't leave Felix!" The lizard, as if understanding the gravity of the situation, had positioned himself at the front of his terrarium, head tilted expectantly. "Is that creature significant to you?" Zyla asked, her tone suggesting she found the notion puzzling, but not entirely unreasonable. "He's my friend," Gary said, surprised by the fierce protectiveness in his voice. "Where I go, he goes." Zyla considered this for exactly 2.7 seconds before nodding. "Acceptable. The cosmic dragons appreciate loyalty. It suggests you may survive longer than your predecessor." "My wait, what happened to them?" Gary asked, carefully transferring Felix's terrarium to a carrying case. "He served the dragons for 17 years. Zyla replied, her metallic fingers drumming against her thigh. "Until he didn't." The ominous statement hung in the air as Gary finished packing, mind reeling with questions he was too afraid to ask. When the 7 minutes expired, Zyla extended her hand. "Come on, your destiny awaits." Gary hesitated only briefly before taking her hand. In that moment of connection, he felt something shift in his perception of reality, as if he'd spent his entire life looking at the world through slightly dirty glasses, and someone had finally cleaned them. "One last thing," he said, voice steadier than he felt. "What exactly do dragons eat?" Zyla's helmet retracted, revealing a face both alien and beautiful, skin like polished obsidian, eyes like distant galaxies. Her smile contained multitudes. "That, Gary Harper, is precisely what you've been chosen to discover." The world dissolved around them. 60 flights of gravity-denied stairs blurred past as Gary clutched Felix's terrarium to his chest, following Ambassador Zyla's impossible pace. The stairwell seemed to stretch and contract with each landing they passed, dimensions bending like taffy in a cosmic taffy puller. "Couldn't we have just teleported?" Gary gasped as they finally burst through a door that hadn't been there seconds before. "Teleportation is imprecise," Zyla replied without breaking stride. "Besides, the exercise will prepare your cardiovascular system for the stress of dragon feeding." They emerged onto a rooftop landing pad where what appeared to be a 1950s convertible hover buggy idled, its chrome finish glowing with an inner light that hurt Gary's eyes if he looked at it directly. The vehicle had no visible engine, no fuel cells, and no driver. "Your chariot," Zyla announced, gesturing toward the passenger seat. Gary settled Felix's terrarium carefully in the back seat before climbing in. "Is this safe?" he asked, noticing the distinct lack of restraint systems. "Absolutely not," Zyla replied cheerfully, sliding into the driver's seat. "But safety is a statistical illusion anyway." The hover buggy roared to life, a sound like a beluga whale hiccuping inside a cathedral, and lurched upward. Gary's stomach remained somewhere on the rooftop as they accelerated into New Avalon's chaotic skyline. The city at night was a jumble of holographic advertisements, residential complexes stacked like precarious Jenga towers, and the occasional green space suspended between buildings. Gary had delivered packages to every district, but he'd never seen New Avalon from this vantage point, or at this speed. "We're going to hit that building!" he shrieked, as they hurtled toward the glass facade of the Quantum Financial Tower. No, we're going to phase through it, Zyla corrected, making no attempt to change course. Gary squeezed his eyes shut, every muscle tensing for impact. Instead, he felt a curious tingling sensation, like static electricity crawling across his skin. When he dared to look again, they were emerging from the other side of the tower, molecules rearranging themselves into proper Gary shape. That was impossible, he whispered. Improbable, Zyla corrected. There's a difference. They careened through New Avalon's airspace for what felt like hours, but might have been minutes. Time seemed fluid in Zyla's presence. Eventually, the dense urban sprawl gave way to the city's outskirts, where abandoned factories and scrap heaps created a rust-colored horizon. The hover buggy descended toward what appeared to be a collision of architectural impossibilities. A Gothic castle wedged between a sprawling junkyard and a surprisingly ordinary noodle shop. The castle's spires twisted like black licorice reaching for the stars, while its foundations seemed to dig into the earth like roots. The Citadel of Possibility, Zyla announced as they touched down. Your new home. Gary stepped out, Felix's terrarium clutched protectively. It looks unstable. It exists in 17 dimensions simultaneously. Zyla explained, You're only perceiving the three-dimensional shadow. The castle's massive oak doors swung open of their own accord, revealing a cavernous entrance hall, lit by floating orbs of multicolored light. The space was dominated by a spiral staircase that seemed to defy several fundamental laws of physics, twisting both up toward a distant ceiling and somehow sideways into what should have been empty air. This way, Zyla directed, striding toward a corridor that materialized as they approached. The dragons await their evening meal. Gary followed on trembling legs, noticing that Felix had pressed himself against the glass of his terrarium, eyes wide with what might have been terror or excitement. It was hard to tell with reptiles. The corridor stretched impossibly, lined with portraits whose subjects moved and whispered as they passed. Gary couldn't make out their words, but their eyes followed him with expressions ranging from pity to amusement. Previous caretakers, Zyla explained, noticing his gaze. Some lasted longer than others. And the one before me? You said 17 years? Bartholomew Blingsnort, an exceptional caretaker until his creativity exceeded acceptable parameters. Before Gary could ask what that meant, they arrived at an enormous circular chamber. The ceiling vaulted so high it disappeared into shadow, while the floor was inlaid with intricate metallic patterns that shifted and flowed like liquid. And there, arranged in a perfect triangle, were the dragons. They were both more and less than Gary had imagined. More. Because their presence filled the chamber with palpable power. An electric current that made the hair on his arms stand on end. Less. Because they were chained, massive links of opalescent material tethering them to 3 equidistant pillars. The blue dragon, Kroner, had scales that rippled with temporal energy, each movement leaving ghost-like after-images in the air. Its eyes were ancient and patient, regarding Gary with the weight of millennia. The orange dragon, Paraxis, radiated heat that Gary could feel from across the chamber. Its scales glowed like banked coals, and wisps of stellar fire escaped its nostrils with each breath. The black dragon, Neolon, was perhaps the most unsettling. Its scales absorbed light rather than reflecting it, creating a dragon-shaped void in reality. Its eyes were pinpricks of white, like distant stars in an empty cosmos. Behold the cosmic dragons, Zyla intoned formally. Weavers of time, burners of star energy, breathers of void. They maintain the balance of reality itself. Gary set Felix's terrarium down carefully. And I'm supposed to feed them? The preparation chamber is through there. Zyla pointed to a door that appeared in the wall. Their meals have already been prepared for your first feeding. In time, you will learn to create the proper mixtures yourself. Gary approached the door with mounting trepidation, pushing it open to reveal what looked like a futuristic kitchen crossed with an alchemist's laboratory. 3 bowls sat on a central island, each containing something that defied easy description. In the first bowl, meant for Kroner, was a paste-like substance that seemed to age and rejuvenate constantly. Artifacts and relics ground together into temporal mulch. The second bowl, for Paraxis, contained what appeared to be bottled star cores, miniature supernovae suspended in crystalline containers, ready to be consumed. The third bowl, for Nihilon, contained nothing. Or rather, it contained what Gary's mind interpreted as nothingness given physical form, a foam of void stuff that hurt his eyes to look at directly. You will present each meal to its corresponding dragon. Xyla instructed, they will consume it, and the reality engine beneath the castle will process the energy to maintain cosmic balance. Gary lifted the first bowl with shaking hands. And if I make a mistake? Xyla's armor reconfigured slightly in what might have been a shrug. Then reality as we know it might unravel, but no pressure. Taking a deep breath, Gary carried Kroner's bowl toward the blue dragon. The creature's massive head lowered to his level, ancient eyes studying him with intelligent curiosity. Dinner is served? Gary offered weakly, holding the bowl up. Kronor's forked tongue flicked out, tasting the air, before the dragon delicately consumed the contents of the bowl. The temporal energy rippling through its scales intensified briefly, and Gary felt a curious sensation, as if he were experiencing the same moment from multiple perspectives simultaneously. Emboldened by the successful first feeding, Gary proceeded to Pyraxis. The orange dragon's heat was almost unbearable as he approached, sweat immediately beading on his forehead. Careful with this one. Xyla called from the edge of the chamber. Pyraxis has a tendency to get excited. Gary quickly placed the bowl before the dragon and stepped back. Pyraxis consumed the star cores with evident relish, crunching through the crystalline containers like potato chips. With each bite, the dragon's internal glow intensified, until Gary had to shield his eyes. Finally, he approached Nihilon, the void dragon. The temperature dropped precipitously as he neared, his breath fogging in the sudden cold. The bowl of nothing felt paradoxically heavy in his hands, as if absence itself had weight. Nihilon regarded Gary with those pinprick star eyes, unblinking and eternal. When the dragon consumed the void foam, Gary experienced a moment of existential vertigo, as if he himself were being unmade and remade in the span of a heartbeat. When all three dragons had been fed, they simultaneously exhaled time, fire, and void merging in the center of the chamber to create a swirling vortex of energy that sank through the floor, presumably to the reality engine below. Well done, Xyla said, appearing at Gary's side. You've completed your first feeding. Gary released a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. That wasn't so bad. Indeed, the dragons seem satisfied, though perhaps not impressed. Gary glanced at the three cosmic beings. They were watching him with what he could have sworn was a mixture of gratitude and condescension, like diners who had received adequate but uninspiring service at a restaurant. Is that normal? He asked. The dragons have been fed the same meals for centuries. Xyla replied. Bartholomew's replacement came rather suddenly. There wasn't time for proper training and meal preparation. So I'll learn to make different meals for them? You'll be provided with the care manual, Xyla said, leading him back toward the corridor. Your quarters are adjacent to the preparation chamber. I'll return in 3 days to check your progress. Gary collected Felix's terrarium, noticing that the lizard had arranged himself in what appeared to be a respectful bow toward the dragons. And if I have questions, the manual should contain all necessary information. Xyla's armor began to shimmer, preparing for departure. Remember, Gary Harper, the balance of reality depends on the contentment of those dragons. Feed them well, feed them regularly, and all will be well. With that enigmatic advice, Xyla disappeared in a flash of improbable light, leaving Gary alone with 3 cosmic dragons and a scheming lizard. Well, he muttered to Felix, I guess we're not in New Avalon anymore. Gary's quarters proved to be surprisingly comfortable, a cozy apartment nestled within the impossible architecture of the Citadel. The living area featured a window that showed a different view every time he looked through it, the swirling heart of a galaxy, a peaceful meadow on what might have been prehistoric Earth, the quantum foam at the universe's edge. He settled Felix's terrarium on a stone pedestal that seemed made for it, then collapsed into an armchair that adjusted its shape to perfectly accommodate his tired body. "Oh, what have we gotten ourselves into, Felix?" he sighed. The lizard flicked his tongue, eyes darting to a leather-bound tome sitting on a nearby desk, the promised care manual. Gary retrieved the hefty book, its cover emblazoned with the title, "On the Proper Feeding and Maintenance of Cosmic Dragons, a Comprehensive Guide to Reality Stabilization." The author was listed as the High Council of Improbable Affairs. "Light reading before bed," Gary muttered, flipping the manual open. The contents were simultaneously precise and vague, written in a bureaucratic style that managed to provide instructions while explaining almost nothing. Pages upon pages detailed the exact consistency required for Kronor's temporal paste, the specific stellar vintages preferred by Paraxis, and the correct absence density for Neolon's void foam. Gary's eyes grew heavy as he waded through chapters with titles like "Proper Temporal Mulching Techniques" and "The Metaphysics of Nothing, a Practical Approach." Just as he was about to surrender to sleep, a slip of paper fell from between the pages. The handwritten note was crammed with tiny, urgent script. "To my successor, if you're reading this, I've either been retired or have ascended to a higher plane, betting on the former. The manual is mostly garbage. The dragons don't want the same bland cosmic porridge every day. They crave variety. The Council doesn't understand this fundamental truth. The dragons don't maintain balance. They create change, experiment, but be discreet. The High Council monitors, but they don't truly see. Good luck. You'll need it. Bartholomew Blingsnort." Gary read the note 3 times, heart pounding. Was this why his predecessor had lasted 17 years? Because he'd gone off script. The implications were staggering. He tucked the note into his pocket and returned to the manual, this time reading between the lines. The rigidity of the instructions, the emphasis on precision and consistency, it all pointed to a system designed to control rather than nurture. "Felix," Gary whispered, "I think we're in the middle of a cosmic bureaucratic nightmare." The lizard nodded sagely. Sleep eventually claimed Gary. His dreams filled with dragons that spoke in riddles and bureaucrats with star-filled eyes who measured reality with outdated instruments. Morning arrived without the sun. The citadel existed in its own temporal bubble, with light simply appearing and disappearing according to some schedule Gary couldn't discern. He awoke determined to understand more about his new role and the true nature of the dragon's purpose. After a breakfast that materialized on his dining table, toast that tasted faintly of stardust and eggs that changed color with each bite, Gary returned to the dragon chamber with the manual tucked under his arm. The 3 cosmic beings acknowledged his presence with subtle movements, Kronor's temporal ripples slowing, Paraxis's glow intensifying slightly, Neolon's void shifting to accommodate his existence in its perceptual field. "Good morning," Gary ventured, feeling foolish but compelled to establish some sort of rapport. "I hope you slept well. Do dragons sleep? The manual doesn't say..." No response came, but Gary hadn't really expected one. He spent the morning observing them, noting how they interacted with their environment and with each other. There was a rhythm to their movements, a silent communication expressed through the energy they emanated. When feeding time approached, Gary retreated to the preparation chamber to find the standard meals already laid out, but this time, he hesitated. Bartholomew's note burned in his pocket. The dragons craved variety. They weren't maintainers but creators of change. What if... Gary examined the ingredient storage, a walk-in pantry that defied spatial limitations, containing shelves upon shelves of cosmic components. Labels like pre-supernova hydrogen, vintage 2027, and distilled quantum uncertainty, and temporal paradox residue handled with care, adorned containers of all shapes and sizes, making a decision that felt simultaneously reckless and inevitable. Gary added a single extra ingredient to each dragon's standard meal. To Kronor's temporal paste, he added a sprinkle of what the label called Future Relic, a small fragment of blueprint showing the eventual collapse of New Avalon City. An event that hadn't happened yet, but was apparently inevitable. To Paraxis's star cores, he added a microfragment of supernova that had occurred in a parallel dimension, its energy signature subtly different from the standard fare. For Nihilon, Gary's modification was more conceptual. He presented the standard void foam. But as he offered it, he meditated on the concept of absence. Specifically, the absence of constraint. The space between rules where freedom existed. The results were immediate and dramatic. Kronor's scales rippled with unprecedented patterns after consuming the modified meal, temporal energies dancing in configurations Gary had never seen before. The dragon's ancient eyes fixed on Gary with new intensity, recognition, perhaps even approval. Paraxis practically purred as the parallel dimension supernova fragment released its energy. The dragon's internal fire burning with colors that shouldn't have existed in this reality. Steam escaped from between its scales, forming symbols in the air that dissipated before Gary could interpret them. Neolon's reaction was the most profound. As the void dragon consumed the standard meal infused with Gary's conceptual rebellion, the darkness of its scales deepened impossibly. For a moment, Gary feared he'd made a catastrophic mistake. Then Neolon exhaled, releasing a cloud of void stuff that formed itself into a complex three-dimensional mandala before dissolving. When the three dragons performed their synchronized energy release, the vortex that sank into the floor was noticeably different, more vibrant, more complex in its patterns, humming with potential rather than mere stability. "I think they liked it," Gary whispered to himself, a smile tugging at his lips. He continued his careful experiments over the next 2 days, making subtle modifications to each meal while maintaining the outward appearance of compliance. The dragons responded with increasing engagement, their energies more focused, their attention on Gary more direct. On the morning of the third day, hours before Xyla's scheduled inspection, Gary was awakened by a strange sensation, a mental nudging, like someone knocking on the door of his consciousness. He opened his eyes to find Felix perched on his chest, the lizard's gaze uncharacteristically intense. "They're talking to you," came a voice in Gary's mind, sophisticated and faintly accented with something ancient. "The dragons. They've been trying to reach you since yesterday." Gary bolted upright, sending Felix scrambling to maintain balance. "You can talk?" "Of course I can talk," the lizard replied, mental voice dripping with disdain. "I simply had no reason to do so until now. The cosmic fingernail fragment that altered your DNA also enhanced your latent telepathic abilities. The dragons have noticed, and they wish to communicate." Gary stared at his pet, mouth agape. "All this time, you've been planning galaxy-spanning conspiracies? Yes, but that's not important right now." Felix flicked his tail impatiently. "The dragons are waiting." Still reeling from the revelation that his pet lizard was both sentient and megalomaniacal, Gary dressed hastily and hurried to the dragon chamber, Felix riding on his shoulder. The three cosmic beings were awake and alert, their energies focused with unusual intensity. As Gary entered, he felt the mental nudging again, stronger now, three distinct presences brushing against his consciousness. I can feel you," he said aloud. "Are you trying to talk to me?" The mental pressure increased, and suddenly Gary's mind was flooded with images, concepts, and emotions, a torrential download of information that would have overwhelmed him if not for the stabilizing presence of Felix's mind acting as a buffer. When the deluge subsided, Gary stood trembling in the center of the chamber, a fundamental truth burning in his mind. "You don't maintain balance," he gasped. "You inject chaos into the reality engine, controlled chaos that drives evolution and change." Kroner's temporal ripples formed a pattern that somehow translated to approval in Gary's mind. "The High Council thinks you preserve stasis, but your true purpose is to prevent reality from becoming static and brittle," Gary continued, piecing together the fragments of understanding the dragons had shared. "You need variety in your meals because different energy patterns create different types of change in the engine." Paraxis released a small jet of flame that shaped itself into an affirmative symbol before dissipating. "And Bartholomew discovered this. He fed you creative combinations for 17 years, pushing the boundaries of what the engine could process." Gary's excitement grew as the picture became clearer, until the council realized something was happening and retired him. Nihilon's void shifted in a pattern that conveyed solemn confirmation. "But why show me this now?" Gary asked. Zyla will be here today if she suspects I'm deviating from the manual. The mental nudging returned, gentler this time, conveying urgency tempered with caution. They believe you have potential. Felix translated, his mental voice precise. More than Bartholomew. They sense the fingernail fragment's influence. It's changing you in ways the council didn't anticipate. What ways? Gary asked, suddenly aware of a subtle difference in his perception, as if he could see the edges of reality, the seams where probability met actuality. You're developing a sense for possibility. Felix explained. The ability to perceive what could be, rather than just what is, it's why they're risking communication now, before the ambassador's inspection. Gary's mind raced with implications. So what do we do? If Zyla discovers I've been experimenting with the meals, hide it. Felix stated simply. For now, the dragons will help conceal the changes in the engine's output. But they want you to continue your experiments, and to prepare for something bigger. Bigger how? But before Felix could answer, a familiar shimmering announced Ambassador Zyla's arrival. The mental presence of the dragons withdrew instantly, leaving Gary standing alone in the center of the chamber as Zyla materialized. Caretaker Harper. She greeted him formally, her armor reconfigured into a more ceremonial configuration. I trust the dragons have been properly fed according to protocol. Gary straightened his posture, channeling every ounce of courier professionalism he'd developed over years of dealing with difficult clients. Absolutely, Ambassador. 3 meals a day, prepared exactly according to the manual. Zyla's helmet retracted, revealing her obsidian features set in an expression of careful neutrality. Excellent. The Council has been monitoring the energy readings. They've noted fluctuations. Gary's heart skipped a beat. Fluctuations. Minor variations in the engine's output. Zyla circled him slowly, her armor making soft musical sounds with each movement. Nothing concerning yet, but unusual for a new caretaker. Perhaps it's an adjustment period, Gary suggested, trying to keep his voice steady. The dragon's getting used to a new feeding hand. Perhaps. Zyla didn't sound convinced. Nevertheless, I will observe today's feeding directly, to ensure proper procedure is being followed. Gary nodded, swallowing hard. Of course, it would be my pleasure to demonstrate. Felix, still perched on Gary's shoulder, dug his claws in slightly. A warning. The lizard's mental voice whispered in his mind, Be careful. She's not just observing, she's hunting for discrepancies. As Gary moved toward the preparation chamber, Zyla's next words froze him in place. Oh, and Harper? The standard meals have already been prepared, by me, to ensure absolute compliance with the manual. Gary turned slowly, forcing a smile. How efficient of you! In the preparation chamber, 3 bowls sat on the central island, identical to the standard meals Gary had been modifying for the past 2 days. Bland, uniform, designed for stability rather than stimulation. Is something wrong? Zyla asked, noting his hesitation. Not at all. Gary replied, lifting the first bowl, just mentally preparing my feeding routine. As he carried Kronor's temporal paste toward the blue dragon, Gary's mind raced for options. The dragons had been clear. They needed variety, needed the creative chaos that drove evolution. But with Zyla watching his every move, how could he modify the meal? Kronor's ancient eyes met Gary's, and he felt a subtle pressure in his mind, not words, but a feeling. Trust. The dragon trusted him to find a way. Inspiration struck like lightning. The fingernail fragment hadn't just given him telepathic abilities, it had altered his perception of possibility. What if it had changed more? What if his very touch could affect the meals? Taking a chance that felt simultaneously reckless and inevitable. Gary allowed his consciousness to expand as he presented the bowl to Kronor. He focused on the concept of time not as a linear progression, but as a constantly branching tree of possibilities. His fingers tingled where they touched the bowl. Kronor's reaction was subtle, but unmistakable. The dragon's temporal ripples intensified briefly as it consumed the meal, acknowledging Gary's mental contribution. Emboldened, Gary proceeded to paraxis with the second bowl. This time, he concentrated on the nature of energy, not just burning, but transforming, catalyzing, becoming something new, again. That tingling sensation where his skin contacted the container. Pyraxis consumed the star cores with evident satisfaction, internal fire burning brighter than it should have with such standard fare. For Neolon, Gary focused on the most abstract concept yet, the void not as emptiness but as infinite potential, the canvas upon which reality is painted. The bowl felt simultaneously heavier and lighter in his hands. Neolon's void scale shifted in patterns of approval as the dragon consumed the conceptually enhanced meal. When all three dragons performed their synchronized energy release, the vortex that formed was outwardly standard, but Gary could perceive subtle differences, complex harmonics in the energy patterns that hadn't existed before. Satisfactory, Sayla declared, though her tone suggested lingering suspicion. The council will be pleased that protocol is being maintained. The dragons seem content, Gary observed carefully. Content is sufficient. Xyla's armor reconfigured as she prepared to depart. Remember, Harper, stability is the goal. The reality engine requires consistent input to maintain cosmic balance. Of course, Ambassador, stability above all. After Xyla's departure, Gary collapsed into a chair, exhausted from the mental effort and tension. That was either brilliant or incredibly stupid, Felix commented, jumping down to pace the floor. You essentially fed them your own consciousness. It worked, didn't it? Gary massaged his temples, feeling the beginning of a headache. They got their variety without Xyla detecting anything. For now, the lizard cautioned, but the council will continue monitoring, and Xyla's suspicions aren't allayed, merely postponed. Gary stared at the dragons, who watched him with newfound interest. Then we need to be more careful. Find a way to give them what they need without alerting the council. Or, Felix suggested, eyes gleaming with conspiratorial light, we could give the council exactly what they don't want to see. What do you mean? The dragons have been communicating with me too, Gary. They've been waiting centuries for the right caretaker, someone who could understand their true purpose and help them fulfill it. And that's me, because of some cosmic fingernail that fell in my soup? The universe works in mysterious ways, Felix replied, sounding amused. The point is, the dragons don't just want variety in their meals, they want liberation from the constraints the council has placed on them. Gary looked at the massive chains binding the cosmic beings to their pillars. You mean literally? Both literally and metaphorically. Felix's mental voice grew serious. Those aren't just physical restraints, they're conceptual limiters, designed to control how much chaos the dragons can inject into the reality engine. The implications dawned on Gary slowly. If the chains were removed— Not removed, Felix corrected. Transformed. The dragons don't want to destroy reality. They want to evolve it. The chains could become conduits rather than constraints. Gary stood, approaching the dragons with newfound purpose. How? How do we transform the chains? The mental pressure returned. 3 distinct voices merging into one overwhelming concept. The interstice meal. Images flooded Gary's mind, a feeding unlike any in the manual, combining elements meant for all 3 dragons into a unified whole. Past, present, and future fused into one impossible meal that would catalyze the transformation of the chains. It's dangerous, Felix warned, picking up the same mental transmission. If it fails, the backlash could unmake you, and if it succeeds, the council will certainly notice. Gary looked from Felix to the dragons and back again. His old life as a courier seemed distant now, a dream half remembered. This impossible task in an impossible castle felt more real than anything he'd ever experienced. How long until Xyla returns? He asked. 3 days, standard inspection cycle. Gary nodded, decision crystallizing. Then we have 3 days to prepare the interstice meal. The preparation of the interstice meal consumed Gary completely. He slept little, ate mechanically, and spent every waking moment in the ingredient storage, selecting components with newfound intuition. The dragons guided him telepathically, their combined consciousness working through Gary and Felix to assemble something that hadn't existed since the early days of reality, a meal that contained all possibilities simultaneously. From Kronor's domain, He selected not just temporal paste, but fragments of potential futures, crystallized moments of perfect synchronicity, and the distilled essence of a paradox that had collapsed three alternate timelines. From Paraxis's supplies, he harvested star matter from multiple evolutionary stages: the hydrogen of creation, the helium of maturation, the heavier elements of stellar death, and the exotic particles born in supernova. For Nealon's contribution, Gary meditated for hours on the concept of creative void, the space between thoughts where inspiration lives, the pregnant emptiness that precedes existence. These components and dozens more were combined in a process that defied conventional physics, guided by Gary's enhanced perception of possibility and the dragon's ancient knowledge. On the morning of the third day, as Xyla's inspection loomed, the interstice meal was complete, a swirling orb of matter/energy/concept that hurt the eyes and expanded the mind to look upon directly. "It's ready," Gary announced, both to Felix and to the dragons. "But how do we explain this to Xyla? She'll never allow it." "You don't explain," Felix replied. "You act. The Citadel exists in a probability bubble. Once events gain sufficient momentum, not even the Council can easily stop them." Gary carefully transported the interstice meal to the dragon chamber, the orb floating inches above a specially prepared container. The three cosmic beings were alert and expectant, their energies synchronizing in preparation. Precisely on schedule, the air shimmered with Xyla's arrival. But this time, she was not alone. 5 additional figures materialized alongside her, members of the High Council, their forms barely comprehensible to Gary's human perception despite his enhanced awareness. "Caretaker Harper," Xyla began formally, her armor in full ceremonial configuration. "The Council has detected anomalies in the reality engine's output pattern. They have come to observe directly." Gary stood before them, the interstice meal hovering beside him, impossible to hide. "What is that?" demanded one council member, their voice like crystal shattering in slow motion. "That is not a standard meal preparation." "No," Gary agreed, surprising himself with his calm. "It's something better." "This is unacceptable." Another council member stated, "The dragons must receive standard nutrition to maintain cosmic stability." "Stability isn't balance," Gary countered. "It's stagnation. The dragons don't preserve reality, they evolve it through controlled chaos." Xyla's obsidian features registered shock. "Harper, you don't understand what you're saying. The consequences—" "I understand perfectly," Gary interrupted, moving toward the center of the chamber where the dragons waited. "And I understand why you've kept them chained, feeding them the same bland cosmic porridge for centuries. You're afraid of change." The council members rippled with indignation, their forms becoming more alien in their agitation. "This is Bartholomew's heresy again," one hissed. "Harper, stop this immediately or face retirement." Gary looked to the dragons, receiving a unified mental confirmation. It was time. "I think not," he replied, and with a decisive motion, he released the interstice meal. The orb hung suspended in the chamber's center for one breathless moment, then split into 3 equal portions that streaked toward the dragons simultaneously. Each dragon consumed their share in perfect synchrony. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then reality itself seemed to hiccup. The chains binding the dragons began to glow, first with blinding light, then with colors that had no names in human language. The metallic links softened, stretched, transformed, becoming not broken restraints but flowing conduits of pure potential. Energy surged through these newly formed pathways, the dragons channeling unprecedented power into the reality engine below. The floor of the chamber turned transparent, revealing the massive crystalline structure beneath, a geodesic sphere of impossible complexity, now pulsing with rainbow energies. "What have you done?" Xyla whispered, her armor reconfiguring involuntarily in response to the reality fluctuations. The Citadel began to quake, its walls becoming translucent as the probability bubble stretched to accommodate the surge of creative chaos. Through these temporarily transparent barriers, Gary glimpsed multiple versions of New Avalon City, some recognizable, others wildly different, all evolving in real time. "He's done exactly what was needed," came a new voice. A figure stepped through a doorway that hadn't existed seconds before. A meticulously groomed individual wearing what appeared to be a beautician's apron covered in cosmic dust. "Gerald," Zyla acknowledged, her tone caught between reverence and confusion. "The Creator's pedicurist," Felix whispered to Gary, "higher ranked than these bureaucrats could ever hope to be." Gerald surveyed the chamber with professional approval. "The Council has misunderstood the Dragon's purpose from the beginning. They were never meant to maintain stasis. They're catalysts of evolution." "But the reality engine," one council member protested, "is functioning precisely as intended." Gerald completed the thought. "The patterns you've been monitoring are not signs of stability but of controlled growth. What this caretaker has done is correct a centuries-old misalignment." The quaking subsided as the reality engine processed the surge of energy, the Citadel's walls regaining their solidity. But something had fundamentally changed. The air felt richer somehow, buzzing with potential. Gary stood in stunned silence as the council members conferred in a language of pure mathematics, their agitation gradually yielding to acceptance. Zyla's armor had completely reconfigured into a form that somehow expressed both surrender and awakening. "It seems," she said finally, approaching Gary, "that we have been operating under incorrect assumptions. The High Council acknowledges the validity of your approach." "The Dragons are pleased," Felix commented, receiving their mental communication. "They say the engine is now operating at 90% efficiency for the first time since its creation." Gerald nodded, adjusting his apron. "The Creator will be satisfied. Perfect balance was never the goal. Perfect imbalance was the precise amount of chaos needed to prevent entropy without causing collapse." "So what happens now?" Gary asked, looking from Gerald to the Council to the Dragons, who seemed more vibrant and alert than he'd ever seen them. "Now," Gerald replied with a gentle smile, "you get to keep your job, with some adjustments to the description." The negotiations that followed were complex and multidimensional, with the Council reluctantly ceding control over the Dragon's feeding regimen while insisting on monitoring protocols to prevent catastrophic outcomes. Gerald mediated with the patient expertise of someone used to dealing with cosmic egos. In the end, Gary was offered conditional tenure as Dragon Caretaker and Reality Evolution Specialist. His one job expanded into a cosmic partnership with the Dragons themselves. "You will design meals that stimulate controlled evolutionary surges." Zyla explained, her relationship with Gary transformed from supervisor to colleague. "The Council will provide resources but not dictate methods." "And the chains?" Gary asked, looking at the transformed restraints that now pulsed with energy. "They remain as conduits," Gerald clarified. "Complete freedom would be as problematic as complete constraint. The Dragons understand this. They seek evolution, not revolution." As the council members and Gerald departed, Zyla lingered. "I was wrong about you, Harper," she admitted, her obsidian features softened with something like respect. Perhaps the fingernail fragment knew what it was doing. Or perhaps it was just cosmic luck. Gary suggested, "Right soup, right time." Zyla's laugh was like wind chimes in a quantum breeze. "There is no such thing as luck in a probability-managed multiverse, but there is serendipity." With that enigmatic statement, she shimmered and was gone, leaving Gary alone with Felix and the newly liberated Dragons. "So," he addressed them, feeling the strengthened telepathic connection, "what shall we create next?" Months later, the Citadel of Possibility had transformed from a hidden outpost to an open nexus where students of chaos and order came to learn the art of evolutionary balance. The Gothic castle had reconfigured itself, sprouting additional towers, gardens suspended in probability fields, and a particularly excellent noodle shop that had somehow been incorporated from the neighboring establishment. Gary's role had expanded accordingly. He now mentored a small team of apprentice caretakers, each selected for their unique perception of possibility. The Dragons communicated freely with this inner circle, teaching ancient wisdom while learning modern perspectives in return. Felix had appointed himself Chief Strategic Advisor, a position he'd created and that no one dared question. The lizard spent his days plotting benevolent conspiracies to shape galactic development and composing poetry in a language only the dragons could fully appreciate. The High Council maintained a cautious distance, monitoring but rarely interfering. Occasionally, Xyla would visit to observe their progress and update Gary on cosmic politics, which apparently involved a lot of committee meetings in dimensions where time moved differently. Gerald dropped by periodically to inspect the reality engine, always bringing gossip from the creator's inner circle and exotic nail care products that had strange effects on probability fields. Gary's cramped skyloft in New Avalon had been transported to the Citadel's highest tower, transformed, but still recognizably his. He'd kept the chipped ceramic bowl as a reminder of where his journey had begun. On this particular evening, Gary sat by his window, currently showing a spectacular view of galaxies colliding in slow motion, and sipped a fresh bowl of cream of supernova bisque. The familiar taste of stardust and butter brought a smile to his face. Felix lounged nearby, dictating notes for his latest conspiracy to a floating quill pen that wrote in ink that changed color based on the truthfulness of the statement. "You know," Gary mused, "when I was delivering packages, I always had this feeling that I was meant for something else, something bigger." "Feeding cosmic dragons wasn't exactly what you had in mind, I imagine," Felix replied, pausing his dictation. "Not specifically, no," Gary laughed. "But this feels right, like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." "The fingernail fragment altered your destiny parameters," Felix noted. "But it couldn't have worked with someone who didn't have the potential already." Gary took another sip of his bisque, contemplating the swirling galaxies outside his window. Each star system contained countless worlds, each world countless lives, all evolving in patterns influenced, however subtly, by the meals he created for 3 ancient dragons. "All because of one little job," he murmured, and winked at the universe unfolding before him. In the chamber below, the dragon sensed his contentment and responded with a harmonious pulse of energy. Time, fire, and void combining to create something greater than their sum. The reality engine processed this gift, sending ripples of creative potential across countless dimensions. Somewhere, a courier delivered a package containing something unexpected that would change a life. Somewhere else, a chef prepared a soup with ingredients that shouldn't go together, but somehow did. And somewhere beyond conventional perception, the creator smiled at their pedicurist's report on how well the experiment was progressing. The fingernail had fallen exactly where it needed to.